Hi everyone, welcome to 2021. I know it's been a minute since I've last done a video. Needless to say, we had a crazy few weeks there as everyone enjoyed their holidays and of course various events in the United States for those of you who live in the US. So it's been a while, but I'm glad to finally be bringing to you a new video to discuss my 2020 stats as well as my goals for 2021. So looking at the stats for 2020, overall I'm very impressed with what I managed to accomplish in 2020. I managed to read 171 books, and that is by far the most books I've ever read in a year before. Prior to 2020, I'd always set the goal to read 50 books a year. And I managed to do that in 2019 by reading 57 books, but I had had that goal for over 10 years, and more years than not, I didn't even come close to 50 books. So heading into 2020, I remember setting my goal at 50 books again because I was done with grad school and I thought I'd have a lot more time to see friends and socialize and fill my life with other activities, but we all know that once COVID hit, much of other activities got canceled, and I know that for some people they weren't able to read more books, which I totally understand depending on your life circumstance. But for me, I was definitely able to kick it up a gear and read a lot of books, and I'm thankful for having done that. Looking at a few other stats, I know that I really wanted to put an emphasis on reading female authors, not just male authors. Last year gave me an opportunity to read a lot more books written by female authors, and overall I'm pretty pleased. I ended up reading 43.86% female authors, and then 56.14% male author books. And again, just going off of prior trends, I think I usually hovered around 20% female. So I'm definitely impressed that not only was I able to read a lot of books in 2020, but I was able to read a lot of female authors. Another trend that I noticed was that I didn't read as many big books as I wanted to, but when I looked at the length of book based on page number and the data that I had for last year, I tended to rate the book higher the longer the book was. And this kind of surprised me because sometimes I find bigger books a little intimidating, a little daunting. But looking at what I read, for the most part last year, I really tended to enjoy a book more the longer it was. Now, that isn't true for Joyce Carol Oates' book that I had read, and I'll end up putting it up above. But that book was such a disappointment. That was a bit of an outlier. But generally, that trend held true, that the more pages in the book, the more I enjoyed it. And I think part of that also could be impacted by the fact that I read a lot of smaller novellas last year. And I still don't know if I fully understand what a novella really means or what that's defined as. I think it's a book smaller than 250 pages, but beyond that, I don't know if there's other qualifiers that make something a novella. And I didn't enjoy a lot of those. For some reason, I either felt like they were lacking, like I wanted more out of them, or they were just downright boring. So I do think that played a little bit into it. And we have to remember that I didn't really read a lot of larger books last year, so we can't completely rely on that trend, but I am curious to see if it holds in 2021. Another thing I noticed is that I found that once in a while I would read a very popular book, and just to be a part of the national global conversation, to be able to relate to people who've read these common books. And I'm starting to realize that typically the more number of ratings a book has, the more likely I am to rate that book lower. So I took my rating minus the average Goodreads rating to come up with a kind of a crude variance on rating. So if I rated a book let's say I gave it a 2, but its average is a 4, then that variance is a -2. Like my score was a -2 compared to the overall score, if that makes sense. And I'll show a graph, so this will make a little more sense. But what that tells me is that, in general, if a lot of people have read a book and it has a pretty high score, I am going to likely disagree with that score. And I'd like to think that that's a coincidence, that I'm not trying to sabotage books that gain popularity. I don't have anything against the idea of a book becoming really popular. One example that's not part of my 2020 stats, but a book I've already read in 2021 is Sally Rooney's Normal People. And I know that book is a little polarizing. People either love it or they hate it, but it has over 1 million people on Goodreads that have shelved that book, and I thought it was phenomenal. So I think maybe we can kind of buck that trend a little bit, but it's also telling me that I shouldn't feel pressure to read a book just because of its popularity on that alone. One old example from a couple years ago was the book Girl Wash Your Face, and I remember that when that book was taking over, everybody was reading that book. Even people I knew who didn't like to read were reading that book, and that's amazing. I think that's a good thing. I'm all for a book that can attract the crowd that really doesn't generally read, or the person who reads maybe a couple books a year. I fully support that. So I'm not shaming anyone or trying to sound high and mighty or superior. But that book in particular, I really did not enjoy. And what I noticed is that in some cases, if a book like that starts to spread like wildfire amongst a community that doesn't do a lot of reading, they tend to be more impressed by some of the cliches that come up in the book that you've read 1 million times over, but the general wider audience hasn't read 1 million times already. And also they haven't read enough other books to really have a baseline of like a truly, truly great book in their opinion. Like, we're still talking about everyone's individual opinion, but I have a lot of books that are just my absolute favorites. And the more books I read, maybe the more of those really beautiful gems I come across. And then now every time I read a book, that book is standing up against the 500 plus books that I've already read. So it's a little bit harder, if you've read a lot of books, to find a new book that's really going to knock your socks off. Whereas if you've only read maybe let's say you've only read 10 books in your adult life after high school, that's not to say that your enjoyment isn't valid. It's totally valid that you enjoyed the book, but it's a little easier to take the crown or knock the other 10 books down if you've only read 10 books and have that be your favorite book of all time, instead of having a longer list of books, if that makes sense. It's not overly scientific. I read a lot of books, but as far as the statistical significance, I've still barely scratched the surface of all the books that are out there. Another thing that I want to do in general is read longer books, not just because I noticed that I tended to rate them higher, but also just because I got a little obsessed last year when I had the momentum of reading all those books. It kind of felt like a snowball. And so it sort of began to feel like, how high can I go? How many more books can I stack on here? And I think I started to just read as many books as possible. Like towards the end of the year in December, at one point, I was going to try to read 31 books in December. And I didn't accomplish that, but it became a bit of a game to try to see how high I could really push that number, because it kept growing higher and higher. So I noticed that my average page length for last year was 284. It didn't even crack 300. And so this year, going forward, I want to read more books, and I'm hoping I can get my average page count, above 350. I don't know why 350. That's a little arbitrary, but if I manage to do that, it will be the highest average page count of any year that I've had on Goodreads. So I think it would be exciting, and it's a solid number. It's not barely above 300. It's decidedly above 300. So that's one goal that I have. And you can see that if I bucketed the books, I read a couple sizable books last year, but most of them were smaller. So you can't always rely on an average number, But even looking, if we bucket the books that I read, I definitely read a lot of smaller books and very few books that were over 400 pages, for example. All right, now that we've wrapped up the stats, more or less, I'm going to kind of shift into those bigger goals that I hope to achieve in 2021. So I've talked about a couple of them already, wanting my average page count to be above 350. And one thing I want to do is I feel pretty confident that I can go above 50 books again, even though that had historically been a very hard goal to achieve. But, the vaccines are not fully deployed. I'm still working from home with no specific return date to the office, so I don't really have to commute every day. And, things are opening up, but a lot of the world is still not ready to go back to any normal or new normal. The virus still has a lot of challenges ahead, so I don't have a lot of reasons to believe that at least the first half of 2021 are going to be much like the way 2020 was, in that I will have plenty of time for reading. But I want to read maybe 100. I'm going to set a goal of 100 because I would like to think at some point things are going to maybe adjust a little bit more normal. I have a couple weddings that I know are still attempting to happen for 2021. And if they happen, that's going to entail maybe some time home to see some family, if that's provided. So 100, I think, is realistic. It's still a stretch goal for me just because I know how challenging. I mean, that's really about a little over 8 books every month. And that's not super easy. So I'm trying to read maybe 9 books a month so I can stay a little bit ahead of it and see how that shakes out. And so that's one goal. Another goal I have is I grew up in Iowa. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And even though I've lived in Sacramento for 7 years now, I still have an affinity for Iowa and my roots. And Cedar Rapids is actually just 20 minutes north of the University of Iowa. And for those of you who know, University of Iowa is home to the famous Writers Workshop, their MFA program for writing. And they have a lot of books that program has produced, either in alumni or former faculty. You could look at Flannery O'Connor, Kurt Vonnegut. Some of the recent books that have gained popularity were ones like Such a Fun Age and Transcendent Kingdom. So these books are by authors that came out of that program. And it's kind of an arbitrary goal maybe for some to sit there and say, like, I'm going to read books that came out of this MFA program that I have no actual relation to. Like, I didn't go through the program. I'm not an Iowa alum. But I think it caught my attention last year because last year when I started reading all those books, I realized, one, I was a little burnt out on nonfiction because before last year I had predominantly always read nonfiction. I'd read a few fictional books, and most of the fiction I read in high school, I always gravitated to nonfiction. And getting exposed to different booktubers and trying to fight off some of the boredom I felt with the genre I had always been reading, I started to dig deeper into the Iowa Writers Workshop and realized just how important that program really is and how much heft it holds on the world stage. Growing up in Iowa, I had a lot of high school teachers that would mention the writing program and how important Iowa City was to literature and contemporary literature. But I think it always felt a little bit like, okay, well, here we go. Here's my high school teacher trying to overstate the importance of this local flavor. And I never really realized just truly how much this program is relevant. And so it's probably just this nostalgia for back home and this hometown, not really hometown, but almost hometown pride that I really want to read more books on this list. So last November, I said I wanted to read 50 books from Iowa MFA faculty or previous alumni, and 50 is kind of an arbitrary goal. I managed to read 8 last year after I made that goal. So that means that I have 42 to read between now and November. So that fits into the 2021 timeframe. And a few of those books I have beside me to show, just as some examples. So I know that a lot of people have already read Real Life by Brendan Taylor, but he is an alumni of the Iowa Writers Workshop, so this is definitely on my list. Voices After Evelyn. I know, how funny. Evelyn, right? No. But Rick Harsh is also an alum from the Iowa MFA program for the Writers Workshop. So this is another book on my list. I actually found out about this book from Leaf by Leaf, if anyone follows Leaf by Leaf. And it just happened to be that it fit into my goal of the Iowa Writers Workshop. And another book I have, and this one's a bit of a doozy, is the Complete Stories by Flannery O'Connor. And I'm highly interested in this book because Flannery O'Connor has Catholic roots, and she's written books or stories, from my understanding, that have like a disturbing kind of tone to them, but they maintain a realm of like within the realistic. And to me, that's always more fascinating than like this wouldn't be like a thriller, I wouldn't say, but like the thrillers that get very unrealistic, I have a hard time with, similar with horror movies that are very unrealistic. So I'm looking forward to this read, and she was one of the pioneer members of the Writers Workshop. I don't think she was like one of the absolute first, but she was early on in the program and was one of the early most successful authors. And so I'm very, very excited to read this. So keeping in line with my goal of reading bigger books, I have a few books that are some examples of books that I hope to read. And so one of those books is The Swan's Way by Proust. And I haven't read any of Proust's book, and I'm a little intimidated, a little nervous. I really wish I had like the complete set of this book, but I figured that I should probably start with one book and see if I can manage to understand and follow and really get everything out of it before I invest in a box set, in case I find that for some reason it doesn't work for me. I also have A Little Life, and I know this book is mildly controversial at this point. Some people say that we shouldn't be talking about this book on BookTube because it's not the healthiest read for most people. But it is a longer book that I want to get to this year, and one that I know is going to be very emotionally heavy. So it's kind of a mix of making the time for a book this size and then also having the timing be right where you're mentally prepared for a book that's going to be emotionally taxing. And then last on our list for a large book is The Mystery Doc. And this one's sizable. This is about over 1,600 pages. But don't let the size fool you, because this book is written in a very unique format. And a lot of the pages are half blank or partially blank, mostly blank, or there's pictures, or there's sparing text. And so the size is a little misleading. From my understanding, it reads like it's more like 300 pages or 350. So it won't actually be as long as it looks. But this is another book that I found out because of Leaf by Leaf and his channel. So definitely into his channel. And I'll probably link it below just so you can find his channel as well. But pretty excited about this lunker. I've started it. I'm only about 100 pages in. And it's not difficult, but it's one of those books that I need to really be able to just focus for like an entire Saturday or an entire Sunday with no distraction and really dive in so I can make headway, because it's a little disjointed based on the storyline. And I'm finding that when I dip into it, here and there, it's hard to grab that continuity because that larger thread is kind of lost. I think in this book, if you're not reading like larger pieces at a time, or that could just be me and my own mental shortcomings, but that's what I've noticed so far. So excited to continue and finish this. And I'm enjoying it so far. And then the last goal for the year, maybe goal, it's not very tangible. I know most goals should be attainable, specific. But I want to continue to read books that keep me sort of aware, racially aware, culturally aware. I read a lot of books last year in an effort to develop my anti-racism muscle. I read White Supremacy. I read The Hate U Give. I read a lot of books. I can't remember how many, but I want to continue that this year because I think I'm hopeful with the new administration and a new year that we've seen maybe the end of Black Lives Matter or we've gotten through the worst of it. But this work is going to take time, and I don't know if it'll really ever end or if it'll ever be done. But I don't want to stop reading these books just because it's 2021 and Black Lives Matter was part of 2020. So some of the books that I have on my list is James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room. I have Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class on my list. And I have Hood Feminism. I've heard a lot of really good things about this book, so I'm really excited. And I have The Sellout by Paul Beatty. And this book I've also I've dipped into. So I read part of the prologue, and it was one of those books, it's like, it almost reads like dessert. I mean, it's heavy in the sense that there's social commentary here, but it's a satire book, and it's so poetic, and the way it's written is just so intelligently crafted. It's like one of those books where you read almost every paragraph I read, there was like a funny quote that I felt like I needed to like text a friend or call my dad and tell him what I just read. Just really, really funny satirical observations. In the beginning of the prologue, he talks about Nevada and is like makes a comment about Reno, and like I couldn't agree more with with that side comment on Reno. Just brilliantly written. And so this is one of those ones again where I wanted to have the time to devote to it without distraction and really sink my teeth in because it was so well written, and I wanted to be able to appreciate that by sinking my teeth in. So I have to get back to this one, but I'm really excited. I posted about this on my Bookstagram, and somebody local to Sacramento said that she read this book. It's one of her favorite books of all time. And every time she was reading it out in public, people would comment if they'd read it. And she says, if anyone's read this book and they see you reading this book, they're going to want to talk to you about it. So I'm a little late to the game because it came out a few years ago. It's a winner of the Man Booker Prize, now just the Booker Prize. But looking forward to getting back into this as well. So there you have it. Those were kind of my stats from last year. I think I originally planned to make this video a little more jazzed. I love data, but ultimately I kind of realized I just don't have a ton of time to sit here and tinker with the data all day. And I really want to get this video out and talk about my goals and kind of just move into 2021 because I know that hopefully there will be a lot of good things coming this year and better days ahead. So let me know in the comments below if you have any goals that you've set this year for your reading in 2021, if you have any books that are on your TBR, or any other stat considerations that maybe I haven't thought of before. I know some YouTubers, I watched a few videos and they were very creative in their stats. You could do endless slicing and dicing of the data. So would love to hear your comments below because I'm going to try to track my data throughout the year and find new ways at looking at my reading habits. So thank you for watching, and I will talk to you soon.